In a corner of a mysterious place, a blind boy and his dog hold a secret that even the wind can silence. During a party on the old bridge, something unexpected happens, and what seemed like a celebration turns into an unsettling omen. Welcome to the channel. Before we begin, please like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this one. In the picturesque town of Pinecrest Valley, nestled among the majestic mountains of Colorado, where ancestral traditions intertwined with daily life like the threads of a colorful tapestry, there existed a figure who generated both admiration and wariness, Mr. Richard Burton, an ambitious businessman who had built an empire by buying land and influence throughout 2 decades. For the elite of Pinecrest, Richard represented the progress and modernity they so desired. For the original inhabitants, those whose families had lived there for generations, cultivating the land and preserving customs, he was simply an opportunist who took advantage of others' needs. The contrast between these perceptions created a silent tension that hung in the air like the morning mist that embraced the mountains. The elders of the town would often mutter when they saw him pass by in his luxury SUV, "There goes the man who wants to turn our sacred land into a playground for the rich." Richard, with his impeccable white shirt and wide-brimmed hat, seemed immune to these comments, protected by a shell of ambition and determination that he had forged since his youth. His most recent project was the construction of a luxury resort in the highlands surrounding Oak Ridge, a small settlement connected to Pinecrest by an old suspension bridge that crossed a deep canyon. The bridge, built by indigenous hands more than 100 years ago, was considered a symbol of unity and resistance for the community. It was precisely in Oak Ridge where Tommy Wilson lived, a 12-year-old boy who had lost his sight in an accident when he was barely 5, but who had become a symbol of inspiration for the entire region. Despite his condition, Tommy moved around with amazing independence thanks to Rusty, his faithful shepherd dog, specially trained to guide him along the steep paths and irregular terrain of the mountain. Tommy's family owned one of the few parcels that Richard had not managed to acquire, a privileged piece of land overlooking the valley and with access to a sacred spring that, according to local legends, possessed healing properties. Grandma Rose, Tommy's grandmother, was the guardian of these lands and the traditions that accompanied them. At 75, she was recognized as the living memory of the town, capable of precisely remembering events from decades past and interpreting the omens that nature offered to those who knew how to listen. That June morning, the air felt heavy, laden with omens. Richard had announced his visit to Oak Ridge to participate in a charity event organized by the community on the suspension bridge. The event, an annual celebration to raise funds for the local school, was the perfect setting for the businessman to show a more human and accessible facet, a carefully calculated strategy to win over the most skeptical. In the red-roofed adobe house of the Wilson family, Tommy was preparing enthusiastically for the festivity. That day he would present a musical piece with his reed flute, an instrument he had learned to play with extraordinary sensitivity, capable of evoking the sounds of the mountain and the wind through the trees. "Grandma, do you think people will like my music?" he asked while petting Rusty's back, who remained faithfully by his side. Grandma Rose, who was weaving a blanket on the ancient loom inherited from her mother, smiled tenderly. "Your music, Tommy, comes from the heart. It speaks with the voice of our ancestors. Of course they'll like it because it awakens what we all carry inside but sometimes forget." The old woman paused and her face darkened slightly. "Just be careful today. I dreamed about the bridge last night and the wind was blowing too strongly." Tommy nodded seriously. He had learned to trust his grandmother's dreams, messengers of warnings that should not be ignored. At the other end of town, Richard was finalizing the details of his participation in the event. His assistant, Emily Baker, a young and ambitious woman from Denver, meticulously reviewed the agenda. "Remember, Mr. Burton, after your speech on community commitment, we'll present scholarships to the 5 selected students. The local press will be present, and I've also invited a reporter from the state newspaper." The businessman nodded with satisfaction. "Perfect, Emily. Today we need to show that our interest goes beyond business, that we really care about the future of these towns. I especially need to approach the Wilson family. That parcel is crucial to complete the resort grounds. What Richard didn't know was that among the guests was Jack Nelson, a retired journalist who had covered political and corporate scandals for more than 3 decades in major national media. Jack had chosen Pinecrest as a refuge after a tumultuous career, seeking peace and anonymity following the painful loss of his son under circumstances that still tormented him. He had no intention of getting involved in local affairs, but the coincidence of names between Tommy Wilson and his deceased son, Tommy Nelson, had awakened in him a curiosity he couldn't ignore. At noon, the suspension bridge presented a festive appearance, decorated with multicolored paper banners and marigold flowers that contrasted with the depth of the canyon that opened beneath. On both sides, stalls had been set up where women from the community sold crafts, traditional foods, and herbal remedies. The music of marimbas and guitars created a cheerful atmosphere that seemed to rise toward the clear sky. Among the crowd, beginning to gather, the tall, slender figure of Sarah Collins stood out, a canine training specialist who had worked with Rusty during his training as a guide dog. Her connection with Tommy and his family went beyond the professional. She had become a close friend and a firm defender of community rights against business interests. When she saw Richard's SUV arrive, her face visibly tensed. The businessman's arrival at the event was met with divided reactions, polite greetings from local authorities, admiring glances from some young people impressed by his success, and the distrustful silence of the elders who grouped at the edges. Richard, aware of this scrutiny, deployed all his charm, personally greeting each vendor, buying crafts without haggling, and praising the beauty of the place with phrases that sounded rehearsed but effective. The meeting between Richard and the Wilson family was inevitable in such a small space. When it finally occurred, at the very center of the bridge where Tommy was waiting his turn for the musical presentation, the tension was palpable. Grandma Rose maintained the composure, granted by her years and wisdom, but her dark eyes revealed ancestral caution. Tommy, blind to facial expressions but extraordinarily sensitive to energies, tightly gripped Rusty's leash, who in turn remained alert, with ears erect and muscles tense. "It's an honor to finally meet the little musician I've heard so much about," said Richard, extending a hand that remained suspended in the air when he remembered the boy's condition. Tommy, sensing the discomfort, smiled kindly. "The honor is mine, Mr. Burton. My grandmother says you want to change our town." The boy's frankness caused an uncomfortable silence that was interrupted by the announcement of the start of the presentations. As Tommy prepared for his performance, an unexpected breeze began to blow from the canyon, causing the bridge to sway subtly. Grandma Rose looked at the sky with concern, recognizing the sign from her dream. Jack Nelson, who was observing the scene from a prudent distance, couldn't help but notice the strange tension between the businessman and the blind boy, a dynamic that awakened the journalistic instinct he thought dormant. And so, as the music from Tommy's flute began to rise over the canyon, intertwining with the wind that increased in intensity, no one could foresee that that day would mark the beginning of a profound transformation for the entire community of Pinecrest Valley. The melody emanating from Tommy's flute had something magical, an almost supernatural quality that seemed to connect all those present with something deeper and more ancient than themselves. The notes floated in the air like living entities, dancing with the wind that continued to blow from the depths of the canyon. The attendees maintained a reverential silence, even those who moments before had been animatedly conversing. Richard, who had never been particularly sensitive to traditional artistic expressions, found himself holding his breath, captivated by the purity of the sound and the boy's evident connection with his instrument. When the last note dissolved, in the air there was a moment of absolute silence before the applause erupted. Tommy slightly bowed his head in gratitude, while Rusty remained motionless by his side, as if he too had been enchanted by his young master's music. "That boy has an extraordinary gift," Jack Nelson commented to Sarah Collins, who had coincided, With him at one end of the bridge. It's not just talent, she replied with a warm smile. It's the result of truly listening. Tommy perceives sounds that go unnoticed by most. His blindness has opened other senses to him. Jack nodded, thoughtful. It had been years since he had felt that instant connection with a stranger, that sensation of being in front of someone special whose story deserved to be told. The ceremony continued with the official speeches. When Richard's turn came, the businessman deployed all his oratory skills, speaking of progress, opportunities, and the bright future that his project would bring to the region. He promised jobs, improved infrastructure, and educational programs for young people. His words were like honey, sweet and attractive, but to Jack's experienced ears, they sounded hollow, lacking the sincerity he had detected in Tommy's music. After the speeches, the more relaxed part of the event began. People circulated on the bridge, visiting the stalls, trying foods, and conversing. Richard, following the strategy planned with Emily, sought the opportune moment to approach the Wilson family again. He found them near the center of the bridge, where Tommy was receiving congratulations for his musical interpretation. The businessman approached with a calculated smile, carrying a small gift, a flute carved in fine wood, acquired at one of the craft stalls. "Young Tommy, I would like to present you with this small token of recognition for your talent," he said, extending the instrument. Grandma Rose observed the gesture with suspicion, but Tommy, with the courtesy that characterized his family, accepted the gift, brushing the carved surface with his sensitive fingers. "That's very kind, Mr. Burton, although I prefer my reed flute, because it contains the spirit of the wind and the earth." The response, as simple as it was profound, momentarily disconcerted the businessman. Before he could reply, Tommy continued, "My grandmother says that you want to buy our lands to build houses for rich tourists. Why do you want to change our home?" The direct question, formulated without hostility but with crushing honesty, created an uncomfortable silence among those present. Richard, accustomed to negotiating with adults susceptible to flattery or intimidation, suddenly found himself disarmed by the boy's transparency. "It's not about changing, Tommy, but improving. My project will bring progress for everyone," he finally responded, aware that several eyes were fixed on him. "Progress is like the wind," replied Tommy with wisdom beyond his years. "It can be gentle and refreshing, or it can uproot trees. It all depends on its strength and direction." At that moment, as if nature wanted to emphasize the boy's words, a particularly intense gust shook the bridge, causing several of those present to stagger. The movement generated momentary confusion. Tommy, disoriented by the sudden agitation, took a step back, dangerously approaching the edge of the bridge where the railing was lower. Richard, in an instinctive reflex, extended his arm to stabilize himself, but in that abrupt movement he accidentally hit Tommy, who lost his balance. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for the witnesses. Tommy, feeling he was losing his footing, let out a cry of surprise. Rusty, perceiving the immediate danger, reacted with the speed and precision for which he had been trained. He lunged towards his young master, gripping Tommy's belt with his teeth at the precise instant the boy began to fall. The weight of the child dragged both towards the edge, but in an unexpected turn, the dog's leash caught on one of the side supports of the bridge, stopping the fall. They were left suspended over the abyss, held only by the resistance of the special harness that Sarah had designed for the guide dog. Cries of alarm rose among the crowd. Richard, regaining his balance, paled at the scene. Without thinking twice, he leaned over the railing and extended his arm towards Tommy, but couldn't reach him. "Help! The boy is going to fall!" he shouted with genuine desperation. Several men ran to the spot, but it was Jack Nelson who arrived first. With the agility he retained despite his years, the journalist partially hung himself over the edge of the bridge, holding on with one hand while with the other he managed to grasp Tommy. "I've got you, son. Don't let go," he said firmly, ignoring the pain lacerating his shoulder from the effort. Between Jack and two other men, they managed to hoist Tommy back to the safety of the bridge. Rusty was rescued seconds later, received with applause and exclamations of admiration for his bravery. Grandma Rose, who who had observed everything paralyzed by terror, ran to her grandson and hugged him tightly, murmuring prayers of gratitude in her native language, which she only used in moments of intense emotion. Tommy, pale but conscious, groped for his dog, needing to feel his comforting presence. "Thank you, Rusty. I knew you wouldn't let me fall," he whispered, burying his face in the animal's fur. The scene was moving, but soon the initial commotion gave way to questions. How had the accident occurred? Some pointed to the strong gust of wind. Others mentioned how low the railing was in that section of the bridge. Richard, visibly affected, approached the family. "I'm so sorry. It was a terrible accident. The wind. I lost my balance and accidentally..." He didn't complete the phrase, but his expression of remorse seemed sincere. Many saw him as a hero for having been the first to try to help. Sarah, however, observed the scene with an indecipherable expression. Something in the sequence of events seemed strange to her, but she couldn't pinpoint what. She approached Rusty and carefully examined the harness, checking that it had withstood despite the tension it had been subjected to. While doing so, she noticed something peculiar. The dog, usually calm and obedient, showed uneasiness when Richard approached. His ears went back, and a muted growl emanated from his throat. That behavior awakened her professional curiosity. Jack Nelson, once he ensured that Tommy was safe, discreetly withdrew from the center of attention. He didn't like being recognized, having spent years building his anonymity in Pinecrest. But something in the incident had awakened his dormant instinct. Without intending to, he had begun to observe, to make mental notes of details. The expressions, the reactions, the inconsistencies in the story that was beginning to form about what had happened. The event continued, but with a much more somber tone. News of the accident spread quickly through the town. By the time Richard returned to his residence that night, different versions of what had happened had already formed. Emily was waiting for him with a worried expression. "Mr. Burton, this could affect the project's image. People are talking, linking the accident with our presence there." The businessman poured himself a glass of aged whiskey and drank it in one gulp before responding. "Emily, every crisis is an opportunity. Tomorrow we'll announce an improvement program for the bridge, in honor of Tommy and his dog's bravery. We'll turn this into a story of commitment to the community's safety." The young assistant nodded, admiring, as always, her boss's ability to transform adversities into advantages. What neither of them knew was that a few miles away, in the modest adobe house of the Wilsons, Grandma Rose remained awake, sitting next to Tommy's bed, watching him sleep. Her mind reviewed the day's events over and over again, but not as they had been told afterward, but as she had perceived them. "It wasn't just the wind," she murmured to herself. "I saw his arm move before the gust." Outside, the full moon illuminated the valley with its silver light, and somewhere nearby an owl issued its call. For Grandma Rose, knowledgeable about natural omens, that sound confirmed her suspicions. What had happened on the bridge had not been a simple accident, and the wind that had blown with such force was not a common wind, but the breath of the ancestors, warning them of a danger that was just beginning to manifest. The days following the incident passed with a strange mixture of normality and underlying tension in Pinecrest Valley. As Richard had anticipated, his announcement to fund improvements for the bridge and a specialized clinic for children with disabilities was received with gratitude by many, especially by local authorities, always eager to show progress under their management. The regional press extensively covered this display of corporate generosity, with headlines praising the social commitment of Burton Developments. However, in the less visible corners of the town, among conversations held in low voices in the square or during fieldwork, a sense of unease persisted. "It's too convenient," commented Mrs. Margaret, an old midwife who shared with Grandma Rose the status of town sage. "First the accident happens, and then he appears as the great savior, as if it had all been planned." Rumors, as natural in a small community as wildflowers in spring, began to circulate. Some said that Richard had been too close to Tommy before the incident. Others remembered seeing him heatedly conversing with Grandma Rose days before, when the old woman again rejected an offer for her lands. At school, Tommy's classmates received him as a hero when he returned to classes 3 days later. The boy, still affected but rapidly recovering his optimistic spirit, vividly related the sensation of emptiness beneath his feet and the firm hold of Rusty, who had not abandoned him for an instant. "I felt like I was flying for a moment," he explained to his friends during recess. "And then when Rusty grabbed me, it was as if time had stopped." What he didn't tell his classmates but had shared with his grandmother in the privacy of their home was something more disturbing: the physical contact that had preceded his fall. "It wasn't just the wind, Grandma," he had said the night of the incident when they were finally alone. "I felt a push. Someone touched my back just before I lost my balance." Grandma Rose, who already harbored her own suspicions, listened carefully. She didn't want to influence her grandson's memory with direct questions, but asked him to describe each sensation in detail. "Do you remember hearing anything particular at that moment? A breath? Words? Any sound?" Tommy closed his eyes, concentrating on recovering the moment with the precision granted by his heightened sense of hearing. There was a murmur, very low. "I didn't understand the words, but the voice, I think it was Mr. Burton's voice, and he smelled of that cologne he uses, the one that smells like wood and orange." This conversation had remained guarded between them, a shared secret while they decided how to proceed. Grandma. Rose, prudent by nature and experience, carefully considered her options. She knew that directly confronting someone with the power and influence of Richard without compelling evidence could be counterproductive, even dangerous. "We must be like water, Tommy," she explained, using the natural metaphors that formed an essential part of her wisdom. "Water doesn't confront the rock all at once, but surrounds it, erodes it little by little, finds its cracks. In the end, it's the water that prevails." However, destiny had its own plans to accelerate the course of events. One afternoon, while Sarah Collins was making a routine visit to supervise Rusty's continuing training, she noticed something unusual. The dog, normally focused and responsive during sessions, seemed distracted, constantly turning his head toward the main street, as if anticipating or fearing something. The explanation came minutes later, when Richard's SUV passed in front of the house. Rusty's reaction was immediate and surprising. His fur bristled, his lips retracted showing his teeth, and he emitted a deep growl that Sarah had never heard from him before. "Since when does he do that?" she asked, intrigued, observing the animal with professional interest. "Since the day on the bridge," Tommy replied, petting his companion to calm him. "Every time Mr. Burton approaches or he hears his voice, he gets like this." He had never done that with anyone before. For Sarah, a canine behavior specialist with years of experience, that reaction was not simply an animal caprice. Dogs, especially those trained like Rusty, developed specific responses based on traumatic or threatening experiences. Something had happened between the dog and the businessman that had triggered this defensive behavior. "I'd like to do some tests if you'll allow me," she proposed, her mind already elaborating a plan. "We could discover exactly what triggers this reaction." Grandma Rose, who had remained silent observing the scene, slowly nodded. "Do them. Perhaps Rusty can tell us what we didn't see." Meanwhile, at the other end of town, Jack Nelson was struggling against the impulse to get involved. He had chosen Pinecrest precisely to escape the investigative journalism that had defined his career and consumed his personal life. The loss of his son Tommy years ago, under circumstances that still gave him nightmares, had left deep scars. He had sworn not to pursue stories again that would put his hard-won peace of mind at risk. And yet there he was, sitting on the terrace of his modest house, with an open notebook where he had meticulously noted every detail of the incident. On the bridge, every inconsistency in the official version, every reaction that had seemed out of place to him. The shared name between the town's boy and his deceased son seemed more than a coincidence. He felt it as a sign, a call that resonated in the deepest part of his being. His internal debate was interrupted by an unexpected visit. Emily Baker, Richard's assistant, appeared at his door with a professional smile and an elegant envelope. "Mr. Nelson, excuse the intrusion. My boss was very impressed with your bravery during the bridge incident. He would like to invite you to dinner tomorrow, to thank you personally. Jack received the invitation with a neutral expression. Years of interviews with corrupt politicians and dubious businessmen had taught him to hide his thoughts. I appreciate the invitation, Miss Baker, but it was nothing extraordinary. Anyone would have done the same. Emily insisted with the skill of someone accustomed to getting what she seeks. Mr. Burton doesn't take no for an answer when it comes to expressing gratitude. Besides, I mentioned to him your illustrious journalistic career. He's very interested in discussing an editorial project that could benefit you both. The mention of his professional past, which he believed carefully guarded in Pinecrest, alerted Jack. How did Emily know about his career? How deep had the investigation into him been? He accepted the invitation more out of curiosity than courtesy, intuiting that this meeting could offer him pieces of the puzzle that, without intending to, he had begun to assemble. That same night, the paths of Jack and Sarah crossed in the town cantina, one of the few places where locals and occasional visitors shared space. Both strangers, until the bridge incident, quickly discovered an affinity based on their shared distrust of the official version of events. Dogs don't lie, Sarah explained as they drank reposado tequila. Their body language is transparent, without the layers of deception that we humans have perfected. If Rusty reacts like that to Richard, there's a powerful reason. Jack nodded, remembering how the trained dogs he had known during his investigations into drug trafficking responded with almost infallible precision. "And what do you plan to do with that information?" he asked, genuinely intrigued by the approach the specialist would take. "I'm going to document everything. I'll conduct controlled tests recording each reaction. If the behavior is consistent, we'll have evidence that something occurred between Rusty and Richard, something the dog interprets as a threat to Tommy." The conversation continued well into the night, with the cantina practically empty. Without knowing they were being observed, Jack and Sarah shared their respective suspicions, inadvertently forming an alliance that would soon set irreversible events in motion. The next morning, the town awoke to news that spread like wildfire in Dry Prairie. The elementary school where Tommy studied had been temporarily closed due to structural problems. The decision, made by the regional education inspector after a surprise visit, left teachers and parents perplexed, who had never noticed such deficiencies in the century-old building that had even withstood earthquakes. "It's retaliation," Grandma Rose stated when neighbors gathered in front of the closed school. "A warning for us to sell our lands." Some nodded, others showed skepticism, fearful of confronting the power that Richard represented. The businessman, for his part, appeared shortly after offering an immediate solution: to transfer the children to a building he owned while the necessary improvements were made, financed, of course, by Burton Developments as part of their social responsibility program. The offer, apparently generous, divided the community even more. For Grandma Rose, however, that move confirmed her suspicions. That afternoon, while Tommy practiced with his flute in the backyard, the old woman made a decision. She took from an old chest a small object wrapped in cotton cloth, a digital recorder that her eldest grandson, a journalism student in Denver, had given her on his last visit. "To record your stories, Grandma," he had told her then. Now it would have a different use. With determination in her gaze, Grandma Rose headed towards Jack Nelson's residence. It was time for her suspicions to find ears experienced in discovering hidden truths. What she didn't know was that, at that precise moment, Jack was at Richard's mansion, participating in a dinner that would change the course of events. Seated in an opulent dining room overlooking the valley, the businessman and the journalist held an apparently cordial conversation that concealed deep currents of intention and suspicion. "Your trajectory is impressive, Nelson," Richard commented as they tasted a stew prepared by his private chef. "Few journalists have had the impact that you achieved with your investigations. That's why I'm intrigued by your abrupt retirement." Jack maintained his composure, although the reference to his exit from active journalism touched sensitive nerves. "Sometimes stories consume us so much that we lose perspective. I decided it was time to observe life, not just report it." Richard smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his calculating eyes. Precisely because of that perspective, I want to propose something to you. I'm considering financing a book about economic development in traditional communities, the challenges, the opportunities. Your experience would be invaluable in shaping that project. Richard's proposal hung in the luxurious air of the dining room, like the aroma of the stew that floated between them. Jack Nelson maintained his neutral expression, the result of decades facing powerful people who tried to buy or intimidate him. "It's an interesting offer," he finally responded, swirling his glass of red wine. "Though I wonder why contact a retired journalist when there are so many active writers specialized in economic development." Richard smiled, a calculated gesture he had perfected throughout countless negotiations. "Precisely because you're retired, Nelson. Your name still carries weight, but you're not tied to any media that might, let's say, influence the direction of the project. Besides, your reputation for integrity would give credibility to the book." What the businessman didn't mention, and Jack perfectly intuited, was that a retired journalist was more controllable, more vulnerable to the temptation of one last lucrative project before the definitive darkness of professional oblivion. The conversation continued along seemingly casual paths, travel anecdotes, comments on national politics, observations about local culture. However, beneath this surface of courtesy, both men studied each other with the attention of two chess players, anticipating moves, evaluating intentions. When dessert was served, an exquisite caramel flan, Richard subtly changed the direction of the dialogue. "Speaking of local stories, what do you think about the incident with young Tommy? A tragedy that fortunately didn't turn out worse." Jack, who had expected this question, received it with caution. "An unfortunate accident. Although I must admit, I'm intrigued by how a so well-trained dog could act with such precision in a moment like that. Animal loyalty is surprising," commented Richard with apparent unconcern. "However, I'm worried that some in town are misinterpreting what happened." "Misinterpreting?" asked Jack, taking advantage of the opening. "I've heard absurd rumors, insinuations that my proximity to the boy before the accident wasn't casual. As if I had some motive to wish him harm." The businessman let out a laugh that sounded forced even to himself. "Ignorance and superstition are still deeply rooted in these towns, unfortunately." Jack nodded without committing. "Rumors are the currency of small communities, though they generally arise from something, however minimal it may be." Before Richard could respond, Emily appeared in the dining room with a concerned expression. She leaned to whisper something in her boss's ear. The businessman's face tensed momentarily before regaining his composure. "You'll excuse me, Nelson. An urgent matter requires my attention. Emily will accompany you while we finish our conversation about the book." As soon as Richard left the dining room, Jack noticed a subtle change in the mansion's atmosphere. The servants, previously discreet but visible, seemed to evaporate. Emily remained with him, but her professional attitude had acquired a barely disguised surveillance nuance. Something had altered the evening's plans. Jack, too experienced to show impatience, continued savoring his dessert with apparent tranquility. "Excellent flan. The caramel must be artisanal, right?" Emily nodded, trying to maintain the facade of normality. "From a specialty shop. Mr. Burton has an exclusive supplier." "Exclusivity seems to be his personal seal," commented Jack, observing the opulent details of the dining room, "though it must be difficult to maintain in a town where everyone knows each other." The assistant didn't respond, limiting herself to a professional smile. 10 minutes later, Richard returned with an expression that oscillated between controlled irritation and forced cordiality. "I apologize for the interruption, Nelson. Business never respects dinner hours." The rest of the evening passed with an underground tension that contrasted with the apparent normality of the conversation. When Jack finally said goodbye, the book proposal had been left in an ambiguous "I'll think about it," and he carried with him the certainty that something important had happened during that interruption. What Jack couldn't know was that, exactly at the same time Emily interrupted the dinner, Grandma Rose had arrived at his house to find it empty. The old woman, after waiting in vain for almost an hour, had left a note written in her precise calligraphy. "We need to talk about what really happened on the bridge. I'll come tomorrow at noon." Attached to the note, she had left the small digital recorder. Upon returning to his house near midnight, Jack found both objects under his door. The recorder contained a single audio file, dated the day of the incident on the bridge. Pressing the play button, he first heard the ambient sound of the celebration, music, conversations, the wind. Then, with surprising clarity, Grandma Rose's voice narrating what she had seen and heard just before Tommy's fall. "I was observing from the end of the bridge," the old woman explained in the recording. "I saw Mr. Burton approach my grandson. The wind was strong, yes, but not strong enough to cause what happened. I saw his arm move intentionally, not like someone losing balance, but like someone executing a calculated movement. And just before I heard him murmur something. I couldn't distinguish the exact words, but his expression, I know it well. It's the same he had 40 years ago, when he tried to take these lands from us for the first time." The last revelation left Jack perplexed. Richard's father? Was there an old story between the families that hadn't come to light? The recording continued with details about how Grandma Rose had initially kept silent, evaluating the situation, observing the reactions, especially Rusty's, whose protective behavior toward Tommy had dramatically intensified after the incident. "The dog knows," the old woman concluded. "Animals perceive true intentions, and now he fears for my grandson every time that man approaches." Jack listened to the recording 3 times, each time more convinced that he had stumbled upon a much more complex and old story than it initially seemed. His journalistic instinct, dormant but never extinguished, was coming to life again. Meanwhile, at the veterinary clinic that Sarah used for special cases, the canine behavior specialist was developing a meticulous experiment. With the Wilson family's permission, she had installed cameras and sensors to record Rusty's reactions to different stimuli. The dog, accustomed to training sessions, cooperated with his usual willingness. "What we're looking for," Sarah explained to her assistant, "are consistent responses to specific stimuli related to Richard. His voice, his smell, even the mention of his name." The initial tests confirmed what they had already observed informally. Rusty showed clear signs of stress and defensive posture when presented with elements associated with the businessman. But Sarah needed more, something that could be considered objective evidence, not merely interpretable reactions. The opportunity came unexpectedly when Dave, her assistant, suggested using recordings from the event on the bridge. "My cousin was documenting the celebration with a drone," he explained. "He has aerial shots of the entire event, including the moment of the accident." The images, although captured from a certain height, offered a unique perspective. Sarah reviewed them meticulously, frame by frame, looking for any relevant detail. What she found left her breathless. Just before the critical moment, Richard could be clearly observed extending his arm toward Tommy in a way that didn't correspond with someone losing balance, but with a deliberate movement. Even more revealing, the sequence showed Rusty already in an alert position before the boy began to stagger, as if he had perceived the danger before it materialized. "This changes everything," murmured Sarah, aware that she had just crossed a point of no return. "We need to show this to Jack Nelson." The next morning dawned with a palpable tension in Pinecrest Valley. Rumors about the school closure and Richard's true intentions spread like fog among the adobe and red-tiled houses. In the main square, a group of mothers and grandmothers had gathered to organize a peaceful protest, demanding the immediate reopening of the educational center. Among them, the firm voice of Mrs. Margaret, the old midwife, stood out. "It's no coincidence that they close precisely the school where Tommy Wilson studies," she declared with the authority conferred by her 80 years of life in the town. "It's a warning for all those who resist selling their lands." News of the protest quickly reached Richard, who convened an emergency meeting with the mayor and some allied local businessmen. His strategy was clear: present the proposed improvements as an undeniable benefit to the community, painting opponents as resistant to progress, anchored in obsolete traditions. The future of Pinecrest is at stake, he argued, with the polished rhetoric of someone who has won many similar battles. Do we prefer our young people to emigrate to the capital in search of opportunities, or do we create right here the conditions for their development? The mayor, a middle-aged man perpetually trapped between business interests and his voters, demands nodded without fully committing. The community needs concrete guarantees, Mr. Burton. The school closure has generated mistrust. Precisely why I offer not only to repair the current school, but to build a new one, modern, with technology and resources these children would never have had otherwise, responded the businessman, spreading impressive architectural plans on the table. What he didn't mention was the proposed location for the new school, a plot that would require families to daily cross the area destined for the resort, creating a constant flow of potential workers and eventually normalizing the presence of the tourist complex among the most reluctant. While this meeting was taking place, Jack Nelson was receiving Sarah Collins and Grandma Rose at his house. The meeting, planned with discretion, aimed to share and analyze the evidence collected by each one. On the rustic wooden table in the living room, they arranged their findings: Grandma Rose's recording, the drone images analyzed by Sarah, and the detailed notes that Jack had taken during his dinner with Richard. What we have here, Jack began, with the systematic methodology that had characterized his career, are pieces of a larger puzzle. Individually, each element could be dismissed. Together, they begin to form a consistent pattern. Sarah nodded, pointing to the sequence of drone images. Rusty's behavior is crucial. Dogs detect aggressive intentions before they physically manifest. They do it through signals barely perceptible to us: facial micro-expressions, changes in body odor produced by adrenaline, alterations in muscle tone. And my grandson confirmed he felt a push, not just the wind, added Grandma Rose. Tommy never lies. If he says someone pushed him, that's what happened. Jack reflected a moment before sharing what he had discovered during his preliminary investigation. There's something more. Last night, after listening to Grandma Rose's recording, I searched the digital archives of the newspaper where I worked. 40 years ago, Burton Construction, the company founded by Richard's father, was involved in a territorial conflict with indigenous communities in this region. My husband led the resistance, confirmed Grandma Rose, her dark eyes shining with the memory. Edward Burton, Richard's father, tried to buy our lands for a mining project. When we refused, the accidents began, the veiled threats, the mysterious contamination of our crops. History repeating itself, murmured Sarah, but this time we have something they didn't have then: documented evidence. The conversation was interrupted by an insistent knock on the door. Upon opening, Jack found Dave, Sarah's assistant, visibly agitated. They've arrested my cousin for using the drone without official permission during the event. The police confiscated all his recordings and equipment. The news fell like a cold bucket of water on those present. It was evident that Richard had begun to mobilize his influences to eliminate potential evidence. We must act quickly, determined Jack, his investigative journalist instinct now fully awake, before more evidence disappears. What none of them could foresee was that, at that precise moment, Tommy was experiencing his own revelation. Sitting in the backyard of his house, practicing with his flute while Rusty rested at his feet, the boy suddenly stopped playing. A memory until then blurred by trauma and confusion emerged with crystalline clarity in his mind. The words murmured by Richard just before the push finally made sense. "This is for your grandfather." A phrase that, in the context of what he now knew about the historical conflict between the families, acquired an ominous meaning. This testimony, coming from someone within Richard's own organization, fell like lightning on the careful corporate image that the businessman had built over years. The journalists, who until that moment might have maintained certain professional objectivity, immediately perceived the depth of the story developing before their eyes. It wasn't simply a territorial dispute or a clash between tradition and modernity, but a potential case of systematic corruption, abuse of power, institutional manipulation. The cameras now focused on the faces of the workers who had joined Ron, ordinary men and women who risked their livelihood for moral convictions. an image that resonated deeply in a country where the struggle between economic power and community rights had a long and painful history. The hastily announced press conference by Richard became a very different scenario than he had planned. The main conference room of Burton Developments, with its minimalist decoration and windows overlooking the valley, was now crowded with journalists whose questions he could no longer control, as he had done so many times in the past. Instead of triumphantly presenting his plans for the new school and community center, projected on high-definition screens with impressive 3D visualizations, he found himself answering incisive questions that undermined the carefully constructed narrative. Was it true that his father, Edward Burton, had tried to appropriate the same lands 40 years ago and had used coercive methods? Could he explain why the education inspector who ordered the sudden closure of the school was a first cousin of one of his main partners? How did he respond to his own foreman's statements about permit manipulation and pressure on officials? Did he have any comment on the images captured by a drone during the bridge incident, which apparently contradicted his version of events? This last question, formulated by a young reporter from an independent digital media, visibly disconcerted him. His face, trained for decades to maintain composure in tense negotiations, showed for an instant the bewilderment of someone who sees a carefully constructed lie collapsing. "I don't know what images you're talking about," he finally responded, forcing a conciliatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. The unfortunate accident of young Tommy was precisely that, an accident caused by the strong wind and the precarious structure of the bridge, which, by the way, I plan to completely renovate as part of the infrastructural improvements our company offers to the community. The explanation, which in another context might have sounded reasonable, now seemed hollow in the face of the accumulation of contradictions and testimonies. It was then that Jack Nelson, who had remained discreetly among the journalists, taking advantage of the fact that few recognized him after years of retirement, stood up with the calm determination of someone who has been waiting for the precise moment to act. "I have backup copies of those recordings here," he announced, showing a USB drive that he held up visible to all cameras, and also the recorded testimony of Grandma Rose Wilson about what she witnessed, as well as the professional report of specialist Sarah Collins on the guide dog's behavior after the incident, which shows traumatic reactions specifically associated with your presence, Mr. Burton. The entire room sank into an expectant silence, that moment that every journalist instinctively recognizes when a story takes an irrevocable turn. The cameras turned to Jack, whose face, weathered by decades of pursuing uncomfortable truths, now showed the contained satisfaction of someone completing a long-postponed mission. Richard stared fixedly at Jack, recognizing in him the adversary he had fatally underestimated. He wasn't just a retired journalist seeking peace in a small town. He was a man who had found a new cause, a purpose that resonated with his own unhealed wounds, and who had provided the community resistance with the precise tools they needed. All of this is completely absurd, Richard tried to defend himself, but the authoritarian tone he had so often used to settle uncomfortable discussions now sounded forced, almost pathetic. Obvious manipulations by people who resist progress out of pure irrational traditionalism, who prefer to keep their community in backwardness and poverty by clinging to superstitions and obsolete customs. What I offer is development, jobs, modern infrastructure, quality education. His words, which in another context might have sounded reasonable and even progressive to some, now revealed an underlying contempt for the community and its values, confirming exactly what the inhabitants of Pinecrest suspected about his true intentions. The climactic point came when the doors of the conference room opened wide and Tommy entered, guided by Rusty. His appearance, carefully planned by Jack and Sarah, created a powerful visual moment that no media could ignore. The blind boy, a living symbol of vulnerability but also of the community's unbreakable dignity, directly confronting the man who had tried to harm him. Rusty's reaction was immediate and unequivocal. Upon detecting Richard's presence, the animal adopted a defensive posture, placing himself firmly between his young master and the businessman, with visibly bristled fur and a muted growl emanating from his throat. It wasn't the reaction of an aggressive or poorly trained dog, but the precise and controlled response of a highly trained animal that identified a specific threat. The dog's behavior, exactly as Sarah had meticulously documented in her report, offered a dramatic and visible validation for all present, especially for the cameras that were broadcasting the scene live to the entire country. "Animals sense what we sometimes ignore or pretend not to see," Tommy said in a clear and serene voice, showing a maturity that contrasted with his small and vulnerable figure. "Rusty knew from the first moment that you tried to hurt me. His instinct doesn't lie, has no hidden interests, and knows nothing about real estate business. I only confirmed what he already knew when I finally remembered your exact words before pushing me. 'This is for your grandfather.'" The phrase, pronounced with the crystalline clarity of someone reciting a long meditated truth, fell like a definitive sentence in the silent room. Richard, for the first time in his long and successful career, was literally left speechless. His face, usually animated by an unshakable confidence in his own power, now showed a disconcerting mixture of emotions: surprise, indignation, but above all, the bitter recognition of defeat. The consequences unfolded with the inevitability of an avalanche. State authorities, pressured by the national media attention that had reached unexpected levels, ordered a thorough investigation into the unjustified closure of the school. The environmental agency intervened to review the permits granted to the resort project, discovering significant irregularities in the environmental impact studies. The National Human Rights Commission sent observers to document possible violations of the community rights of indigenous peoples. The project was indefinitely suspended while these investigations were conducted. Investors, alarmed by the negative publicity and potential legal implications, began to discreetly withdraw their financial backing. Burton Development's shares fell dramatically on the stock market, significantly affecting Richard's personal fortune. But the real change, the deepest and most significant, occurred in the community itself. The confrontation with Richard, although painful and risky, had had an unexpected effect, strengthening the bonds between generations, between traditionalists and progressives, between original inhabitants and newcomers like Jack. Young people, who had considered emigrating to the city, rediscovered the value of their cultural heritage and began to explore ways to develop their communities respecting traditions but incorporating appropriate technologies. Elders who had viewed any change with suspicion recognized the need for adaptation and the importance of integrating new knowledge that would strengthen rather than weaken the community identity. The school reopened its doors a week after the events, with a ceremony that combined traditional and contemporary elements. Tommy performed an original composition with his reed flute, a piece he had created drawing inspiration from the sounds of the wind among the ancient trees. He was accompanied by traditional musicians from the region, but also by young people who incorporated modern instruments, creating a sound dialogue between eras and cultures. The melody, which began with melancholic tones evoking struggle and resistance, gradually evolved toward brighter and more hopeful motifs. It wasn't a song of victory over a defeated enemy, but a celebration of truth, justice, and the possibility of building a future where tradition and progress were not antagonistic, but complementary forces. Richard, defeated but not completely destroyed, discreetly left Pinecrest weeks later. His company would continue operating in other regions, although with a lower profile and, perhaps, with less aggressive methods after the costly lesson learned. Emily Baker, his loyal assistant for years, resigned shortly after the events. In a discreet cafe in the neighboring town, she confessed to Jack that she had always harbored suspicions about her boss's tactics, but until then hadn't found the courage to confront them. "There's a line," she told him with a mixture of shame and relief, "that I thought he would never cross. Manipulating permits, pressuring officials, I justified it as doing business. But when I learned about the boy, what really happened on that bridge, I understood that I had collaborated with something monstrous." The story of Pinecrest Valley took a turn that few had anticipated 6 months earlier. Instead of the luxury resort that would have privatized natural spaces and irrevocably altered the social fabric of the community, an alternative project emerged, conceived and developed by the community itself with the technical support of professionals committed to sustainable development. a model of community ecotourism based on respect for local traditions, conservation of the natural environment, and equitable distribution of benefits. The colonial mansion that Richard had acquired for his offices was recovered by the municipality and transformed into a cultural center where traditional craft workshops, regional cuisine, music, and dance were offered. Grandma Rose's house, which had always been open to neighbors and visitors, was partially transformed into a center for teaching traditional medicine, where the old woman shared her vast knowledge of medicinal plants with students coming not only from neighboring communities, but even from abroad. Doctors and scientists interested in documenting and preserving ancestral knowledge that modern medicine was beginning to recognize. Sarah Collins, inspired by the extraordinary connection between Tommy and Rusty that she had witnessed during those critical days, established a training center for assistance dogs specialized in working with children with disabilities. Her program particularly included young people from the community, teaching them not only training techniques, but a way of relating to animals based on mutual respect and understanding of their natural abilities. And Jack Nelson, the journalist who had come to Pinecrest seeking oblivion and anonymity, found instead an unexpected new beginning. His report on the events of Pinecrest, published in a prestigious national medium under the title The Wind, That Bends But Doesn't Break, gained recognition for its depth and humanity, reviving a career he had believed finished. But even more valuable was the bond he developed with Tommy, becoming a mentor and father figure for the boy who, without knowing it, had helped him reconcile with his own past and the loss of his son. Jack's afternoons now regularly included sessions where he taught Tommy the fundamentals of journalism, how to truly listen, how to formulate precise questions, how to distinguish facts from opinions. The boy, with his extraordinary auditory sensitivity, showed a natural talent for capturing nuances in the voice that revealed hidden intentions and emotions, an invaluable capacity for a future communicator. As for Tommy, he continued growing, among music and nature, between ancestral traditions and new possibilities. His blindness, which some might consider a limitation, had become a different way of perceiving the world, a special sensitivity to capture what remains invisible to many. The music of the wind through the trees, the heartbeats accelerated by fear or lies that contained breath of someone hiding something. His story and that of Rusty, the dog who had saved him with an act of extraordinary loyalty, became a local legend narrated on festival nights as an example of how courage, truth, and justice can manifest in the most unexpected forms. The suspension bridge, that bridge that had been the scene of the incident that changed everything, was restored by the community itself, not as an ostentatious project destined to impress tourists, but as a renewed symbol of connection between past and future, between tradition and true progress, between communities that share a history and a hope. At its inauguration, which coincided with the first anniversary of the events that had transformed Pinecrest, Grandma Rose pronounced words that summarized the lesson collectively learned. This bridge, like our community, is not sustained by a single post or a single rope, but by the combined strength of many elements working together. And as our ancestors taught us, true strength lies not in rigidly resisting, but in knowing how to move with the wind without losing our roots. Like the centennial oak that sways but doesn't break. And so, as the sun set behind the mountains, bathing the valley in golden and purple tones, the music of Tommy's flute rose again, carrying with it the story of Pinecrest Valley, a story of resistance transformed into rebirth, of confrontation converted into union, of threat transmuted into opportunity. A story that, like the wind itself, would travel far, inspiring others to find their own melody of truth and justice. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Tommy and Rusty has deeply moved you. This tale about the strength of a united community, the value of traditions and the power of truth in the face of adversity is just a sample of the stories we bring to you each week. To continue this emotional journey through America's traditions and realities, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories that explore the bonds between people, animals, and nature. Find it here by clicking to your left. If Tommy's courage, Grandma Rose's wisdom, or Rusty's unwavering loyalty touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Your comments are our greatest inspiration. Tell us which character impacted you the most and why. Every day we bring new stories that explore the complexity of life, ancestral traditions, and the values that define us as a community. Next week, you'll discover another fascinating story that